I'm lucky enough to have Paul Hamill in the room this morning, our Regional General Manager, who's going to come up and say a few words and also introduce our first presenter. Paul.
Thanks, Rick, and well done to everyone to be here today. I think just by being here, you're going to be one step ahead of your opponents, and that's what it's about in football, particularly at the senior level. I just want to thank Rick. Rick started with AFL Central Vic about 15 months ago, and we said to him, look, one area we think we can get some really good improvement in our region is in coaching. It's junior coaching, senior coaching, and Rick's certainly taken the bull by the horns and really developed AFCA and given, I think, our region some really good opportunity for everyone to take moving forward. So well done, Rick, and thanks also to La Trobe, who have been very supportive with today. A number of us were there on Friday night. We had a dinner down at the MCG, which was the Coaches Award, and Rick referred to Alistair Clarkson talking at that. Now, he left us with 3 points, and I thought it'd be worth just sharing those with you today. And he said, it doesn't matter what level you're coaching at, whether it's you're the senior coach of an AFL Premiership side, or he had just spent 2 or 3 days at his home club, Caniva. So it doesn't matter what level you're at. There's 3 things you should be really clear on from coaching. The first is to make sure you've got a strong, clear vision for your team and for your club, and it's a shared vision. The second one is that you're really well prepared. And Rick's touched on this already, but you're prepared for every single training session, you're prepared for every game. And the third point is that you communicate, and you communicate well. And you all know that, but your ability to communicate with your players, your ability to communicate with your staff, and your ability to communicate up as well. So if you've got a board that you're reporting to, make sure you communicate well to them. And they were probably the main 3 points. And I think it's the second point is the reason you're here today, and that's the preparation. And pre-season, and I think this is an incredibly important day for all of you, because you get your pre-season right, you have a much better chance of getting your season right. Your pre-season, if you talk to anyone, and Justin will talk about this later, but you talk to anyone at AFL level, you get all your work done in your pre-season. And you guys know it's very difficult during the season because half the guys are sore and injured and they're recovering from the previous game. So if you want to develop a strong game plan, if you want to make sure that everyone's on board with what you're doing, you need to make sure you do it in that pre-season period. And I've been lucky enough, I coached at 8 years at AFL level as an assistant coach, but I've also coached at regional level in Tasmania. And the thing that I've always knew was you don't have a lot of time. You blokes don't have a lot of time with your players. You know, it's not as if you haven't got a week to get them right. You've probably got, 4 hours a week if you're lucky to have them out there in training. So how are you going to use that 4 hours? And that's what today's about. How are you going to use those hours that you've got during pre-season to develop a game plan, to make sure their skills are right, to make sure their fitness is right, to make sure they're sound from a body point of view? How are you going to do it? You haven't got a lot of time to do it. So today is a great opportunity to get some ideas, to get some thoughts, but most of all, to make sure that you're really well prepared as a coach. And use your time as well as you can. I learned really early when I started coaching in Tasmania. I thought, and I'd come from playing and different things at a higher level, and I thought, geez, I haven't really got a lot of time here. I don't think I'm going to be able to spend, I've probably got 2 sessions a week. I don't want to spend one of those days just doing pure running, and that's it, because how am I going to develop their skills in the game plan? So I soon worked out that it's a very difficult exercise to do. So make sure you really plan your time well and do it well. So enjoy today. We're really lucky today to have Justin Crowe with us. Justin's, Rick talked earlier about our jobs as coaches is to develop our players. I think it's really important you're developing yourself as well, and you guys are doing that by being here. Justin's someone who's developed himself really well over the years. Justin played football. He was at the Collingwood Football Club. Justin's a physiotherapist by trade originally. That's what he started. Then he went down more the fitness path. Started to study, to get himself up to speed in that area, and now he's one of the leaders throughout Victoria. And he's even just this week, he spent a week at Melbourne Uni, and he's just finished a Master of Enterprise, an executive course at Melbourne Uni, on top of all the fitness, the physio and all the other areas he's done. So he continually looks to develop himself. And as a result of that, he moved over he started at Collingwood in the high performance area. He's now the high performance manager at Essendon, and he's doing a terrific job. But this is one person who continues to develop himself, and that's what we want to see with our players. So we're really privileged to have Justin, who's given us his time today to come up here, and we look forward to hearing from him. Thanks, Justin.
I suppose what I wanted to do was basically touch on some fundamentals or some philosophies of pre-season and some really basic things that we do. And then probably move on more to some sort of things that are exciting me and interesting and that I'm finding interesting at the moment later in the presentation. But really I'm happy to talk about anything that you're interested in talking about. So if you have any questions along the way, I'm very happy to get sidetracked and follow a train of thought or an issue. If you want to flick through. But the main thing I think from a conditioning perspective you need to consider with pre-season is you need to start with the end in mind, and that means thinking about what the game is going to demand during the season when your players are playing. So we like to think at the moment at Essendon about what is the hardest thing our players are going to have to do in season. Is that a grand final in the third quarter when we're 3 goals down, we're 2 players down injured? What sort of conditioning requirements are we going to need to prepare our players with to cope with that situation? So you might also want to think about things like in season. You've got obviously a match during a week, so one really big session, and you might have 1 or 2 other sessions or 3 with your players. So start to think about through your pre-season what you're actually preparing you guys for. And it's worth thinking about specifically what is the hardest situation you're going to need to have your players ready for. In general, I think that means that your in-season weeks should be easier than your pre-season. So if you want to prepare someone for something, you generally make it harder than what you're preparing them for. So you can be really confident that they'll cope. I like to think that our guys get to the end of pre-season and are quite relieved that the in-season has started and that they can get in the routine of week-to-week football. I'm going to talk a little bit about some basics of conditioning. I like to layer pre-season, so we start with an aerobic phase, we move to more lactic and then into speed in the lead in the season. You don't have to do it this way, but there's some logical and quite compelling reasons why it's worth working through those conditioning elements in that order. And the first of those is that your aerobic conditioning system, so aerobic running is running that you'll do, and you can just use oxygen. So just by breathing, you can sustain running in an aerobic sense for as long as you need to. Just by, say you're running a marathon, just oxygen coming in is enough that you can just keep sustaining that pace or that effort. Once you get above a certain level, your body starts to produce lactic acid, and at that point, it gets harder to recover from. That's when you're getting your heavy legs and you're getting that sort of high level of discomfort that can come with that other sort of conditioning. Now, your aerobic conditioning takes a while to get, which we'll talk about at an aerobic base, but once you've got it, it's the longest to keep. So you can get injured for a couple of weeks and probably still keep your aerobic base. So it's the last thing to go. And the bigger your base is, the less likely you are actually to flick over into that lactic zone where you're actually becoming into that state where it can be harder to recover from. The reason we put speed last is that's the first thing to go once you lose it. And it's also really important that you've got a base of conditioning before you introduce that program, because it's probably the highest risk element in terms of injury in pre-season. I've got a couple of friends in rowing, and just touching on the lactic bit, it's interesting because everyone sort of knows lactic is sort of uncomfortable and painful, and rowers in particular sort of find that they get this lactic sort of sensation a lot. So I was sort of talking to them and said, I don't know how you do it, like go through that lactic all the time. And their answer to me was, what are you talking about? That's not, in football we have to go through real pain. They sort of, it's very much about perception. And I think that in that lactic stage we can train a tolerance to it in terms of a mental attitude, because it is just discomfort. And also you can train the body to actually deal with that lactic acid in a more efficient way by putting players through situations where they experience it in pre-season. I personally am a lot more comfortable with getting a knock than lactic acid, but that's just where I come from. Flick through, I reckon. So just a bit of a look at a basic layout for pre-season. And you find this sort of thing in any number of exercise physiology textbooks. Through November and December, we're very much aerobic focused. If you're looking at heart rates, you're about 60 to 80%. The reality is probably most of our players don't get into lactic till about 85% of their max heart rate. Dual MPM, that's metres per minute, so that's got to do with how much distance our players are covering each minute of drill and training. For aerobic conditioning, we try to make sure our players are moving around a lot rather than short bursts of efforts. They're actually on the move, and that can be, you can see the minimised breaks. This is probably one of the most difficult time for our coaches as we try to coordinate the objectives of the football coaches and the objectives of the conditioning coaches in this phase of pre-season, because they want to coach a lot and they want to stop drills and talk through things, but I want our players moving around. So what we tend to do is run a drill and then leave time between for that coaching element. Running breakdown, so talk mostly about volume. Now I'm going to use a few terms through this talk. B3 is just part of our language at Essendon basically, which means running above 18k an hour. And that's where we think players start to become lactic. So on VO2 testing, we think our players get out of the aerobic zone once they're in B3 speed, and B4 is 24k an hour or above, so that's sprinting. Don't worry about learning those, that's just so you understand what I'm referring to. In that December-January period, you can see we actually introduced a bit more lactic training. Higher heart rates, probably higher density of drills, more change of direction, and some higher speeds. We allow increased rest. For example, we might try to match up rest periods between drills with the time a player might spend on the bench, and really ramp up the intensity. In February, March, as we're preparing for games and probably playing practice matches, we really want to get that sharpness and that speed and that last component of pre-season ready, and a lot of our training at least once a week will be almost a match, potentially a practice match, but a lot of match simulation training, high speed. Training should really start to look a lot like an AFL football match. I've got the gym column down the end because I think if your players are doing weights or if your players are doing any sort of supplementary training, it's worthwhile matching that up with what you're doing with your running. So hypertrophy in the gym basically means volume training to put on size. Again, that's the last thing to lose. So we think there's some quite reasonable benefit of getting your size on early, particularly once you hit the season. It can be hard for younger, skinnier players to put size on. Strength training or circuit training is a pretty good mix for that lactic phase of pre-season, and then power and speed go really nicely together. So we're training power in the gym and speed out in the track, and getting a nice complementary nature to the sort of structure of our pre-season. Any sort of general questions about that as a layout? It's pretty basic, but it's also I think really important to think about how you're going to layer and progress your conditioning elements in your pre-season.
What about, say, for a senior coach here, Justin, that may not start training again until January? So that phase one has to roll into that period?
Yeah, it's a good question. So that was about if you've got less time and you're starting later, I'd still strongly recommend you do some aerobic work at the start of your pre-season. Even if you're pushing, even if you're maybe compressing your lactic a bit and pushing your speed back towards the end of practice matches. I think that aerobic base is absolutely essential to cope with AFL football. And that's just my opinion, but I probably wouldn't compromise on the start. Look at how long you've got. and try and prescribe some aerobic drills and maybe some running at least for the start of pre-seasons, so you've got a base that you can hold hopefully late into your seasons. This is something else I thought I'd throw up because it's interesting. Using more and more individual development plans for players, and obviously time is an issue for a lot of people in this group, but it's just worth thinking about how you might manage individuals or certain groups within your playing list in terms of their conditioning. So each player at Essendon has a development plan. They have a football component that might, potentially a player might be a poor kick or whatever else that they'll address with their coaches. They have a body component, which my team looks after, and they'll have a mind or a person component. Now, in the body component, we break it up into different areas. So I'm going to try and talk loud enough over here. So we look at the energy system priorities. So a good example of that is how different players have different needs. So there's two players that are listed at the moment, brothers. There's Jackson Merritt and Zach Merritt. They're both actually quite different athletes. So Jackson's a quite good aerobic runner. He's got a good 2K. He moves quite nicely. He's a natural runner. But slightly built. Zach, his brother, is quite powerful. He's quite stocky. Not a natural 2K runner, but very quick, and he's putting on size and strength at a much bigger rate than Jackson. So these are brothers, but they've got both quite different needs or deficits. So for Jackson, when he does running, he does more quicker, sharper stuff, and then in the gym, he's doing more trying to put on size and strength, because that's what he needs to play at the level. Whereas Zach, and he's actually quite good at those two things, he's doing a lot of work with his aerobic running. So when Zach does an extra running session, he'll do a longer run, sort of build his tank and get him up in the field at some stage. So if you have the time or you have the opportunity, think about what individuals in your group might need. For example, if you've got 20 minutes at the end of your session of some running, and you've got most of your group might need to do longer running, you might have an aerobic base to do a long distance runner who needs to get sharper and quicker. Why not get him to do something else that's more specific? This applies all through the programs. In the gym, you'd say you've got Tom Bell Chambers, big, strong guy. We work with his power and his speed. Joe Danaher, we try and put on size. Profiling each guy, what do they need most, and targeting the program for that. Other individual things, some of the young guys, we get in the boxing ring specifically to work their aggression, combativeness, and confidence. But there are other things you might identify some of the players need. And again, you've got to work out the best way to use your time. But there might be ways just to keep working on each player's individual needs. And then also have that player really aware of what they have to work on. And if they have extra time, you can provide their own plan. Injury prevention, again, something that really only if they have time. We'll screen our players in terms of where we think they might be efficient in terms of injury risk. And then before training, guys who are stiff to the hips will do hip stretching. Guys who are stiff to the upper body might do upper body stretching. Guys who have poor landing mechanics might practice the landing. Just trying to individualise and minimise risk in individuals based on the profile as their needs. Thanks, Mel. So this is a basic structure of a week that we use. There's a couple of things that I think about here is when you're probably structuring pre-season, think about what your in-season is going to look like. So we have one really big session a week, which is a match. So I try to make sure that on a Friday we have a really high volume, high intensity session. And then I'll tend to think about the rest of the week in terms of maybe a bit of a lower session on a Wednesday and then a moderate session on a Monday, and just bringing them through. But again, whatever your structure is in season, try not to make it too different from what you're actually going to do through the pre-season. My personal preference is not to do sessions 2 days in a row because we tend to get less tendon injuries that way and bony stress injuries. But you can, and your players will get used to whatever you get them to do, they'll get used to and they'll adapt to, as long as you're consistent with your application. So if you have to train 2 days in a row, that's okay. But my preference is not to. On a Monday, we'll have a main session. Players will go out on the track. If one of our sessions is quicker, we tend to do that on the Monday because they're fresher and we get a better result out of them. Tuesday, players will come in. A lot of that individual needs stuff, working on their own individual deficits. So perhaps they might get on the bike, perhaps they might go out and do kicking practice, video, education, those sort of things, extra weights if required. Wednesday is very much a teaching day for us, so game plan related. A lot of coaches, this session often goes longer than any other session, but we don't clock up the distance or necessarily have the intensity of the others. Very much about teaching and education. And then, like I mentioned, Friday is when we hit them hard with some volume and speed. Saturday, we generally still keep as a work day, individual needs, working on what an individual player might have to work on to make themselves a better footballer in the Sunday off. You skin it a whole number of ways. I've seen it skin different ways, different clubs. But I think probably the main principle would be to have something similar to what you're actually going to do in season.
Justin, can you just tell us a little bit about what craft is?
Yeah, so craft you'll find will be called different things, different places. But craft is time in the program when a player will go with a football coach or a development coach and work on a particular aspect. So Cale Hooker for craft generally does a lot of spoiling practice and contested marking practice. Other players might do Jordan might do goal kicking in that time. It's the idea is they spend time mastering their craft, whatever that is. It might be things they're poor at, might be things they're good at, but hopefully it's something that's actually going to help them with their own game.
And just back on training 2 days in a row, if you do have to train 2 days in a row, the second day, well, what combination should that be? Is the more dynamic type session the first or the second?
It's a good question. If you had 2 days in a row, my preference would be to probably build in on the first one and then really have a crack on the second. You're going to need probably more recovery from the second, so maybe some teaching-based work or lower intensity on the first, and then have a real go in the second, and have some recovery following that. Now this again, don't know too much about the B5 stuff. This is something I'm interested in at the moment. So we've been in season particular finding at some weeks our players look really sharp. They accelerate well. They come back to the ball properly. And other weeks we see them flatter. So we've been putting a lot of thought and work into actually keeping our guys sharp through the season. And probably the best measure we've found to do this is a GPS-based one, which measures their accelerations per minute. But I want you to think about this in terms of starting with the end in mind. So when I presented the players about this measure we're going to use, which is accelerations based, I've got a video clip I've shown them. I'm going to show you now to demonstrate why that's important. Because everything we train should be important in a match. So if you want to come across the video. So this is in the prelim in the third quarter. Porter coming back at Hawthorn. And again, this clip's very much about sharpness coming back to the ball and players being able to accelerate with intensity in a repeated sense. So just a nice clip to watch.
Jordan Lewis is playing a little bit on him, Liam Shields even at times. They're just covering each other really well at Hawthorn. They're not playing any super hard tags apart from Nathan on Boak, obviously. Wines just can't get himself into the game, but we know they're going to come home strong to Port Adelaide. They've done it all year.
Sam Mitchell leading the way. 2 real hard ball wins there from Mitchell. The first one was sensational. Lewis, so stepping up in the contested footy here. Hawthorn at the moment. Look at them closing in. Alpani Carlisle with the Lewis tackle. It's not.
I just think it's a great clip because if we want to be able to do that, we have to actually train it and be able to. And also, what we try to do is quantify it and make sure that we're not actually losing that type of training in season. We'll do that sort of work in the lactic part of pre-season and also towards the end when we get into the speed component. So that's all about high speed efforts over and over again, coming back to the ball with sharpness and acceleration. Keep going. Oh, sorry.
Just for drive, you just told you I wasn't a very good driver.
Yeah, we're going to do it this way. I've got another example. So at the core of our program the last few years has been this idea of B3 running or running over 18k an hour for defensive positioning. So when you run to get in position for defence, you don't just jog there, you actually go there with speed, set up, and then if you're lucky you might have a rest. But then using B4 or really high speed running to be dangerous in attack. And I'll show you another clip where I think both these things that we get players to do in pre-season. So we're always doing B3 running sessions or B4 running sessions and using this language. But it's really important players understand how it's useful in a game and also how they can use these tools that we're going to build in pre-season to help them come the season. So let's just start the clip. We might even pause it in a second. So, alright, just pause it there. So this is Parker here, this one's the bottom. I want you to actually just track him as the clip plays. You see him running defensively.
This one here?
Yeah, that's him there. Running defensively to get in position. And then you'll see him eventually attack once the ball gets turned over.
Now, we go Delzano. He's waiting for Burma. He looks alongside. Reed kept at it. Eventually, Harvey breaks free and goes down to Turner. Another youngster making his mark. Sends it inside the forward 50, well not quite. Gibson a start early last week. The Gray on one lead. All play. Rampy. Shaw. And now Parker.
Gee, that was good. Transition footy, Parker. Reed. Back to Parker. Just gut running. Over the top to Lloyd. Now he goes to Tippett. Got him, no, again. Couldn't quite hang on. Zeeb on the back half.
Would have been a better clip if you had made if Tippett had caught that. But again, from another prelim, I really love that clip. I won't even watch it again because he doesn't just jog back in defence. He actually runs at speed, and that's what we actually train for. At times, he actually stops because he's in the right position, and he waits, and then he runs back hard again. But then when it comes time to attack, he's got the fitness to actually be able to rebound at speed and break the game open. So our players should never complain about the type of running we're doing because it should make sense. That we want to get them ready in a situation in a preliminary final we can actually do this type of running. I reckon watch that one again. I really like that clip.
And then on the left, sort of hugging the boundary, not a good kick from Faden. Good footing so far. Swallow over the back, they might be out now.
We go Delzano. He's waiting for Burma.
So they're always doing the right thing by the team in the right position. Works back hard here.
Gee, that was good. Transition footy, Parker. Reed. Back to Parker. Just gut running. Over the top to Lloyd. Now he goes to Tippett.
This one.
Got him, no, again. Couldn't quite hang on. Zeeb on the back half.
So again, I don't know how many of you would have access to video or different things, but it can really be useful at least to explain why you're doing things, and it helps the pre-season make sense for the player. I wanted to talk about this because this is really important, particularly for coaches who have limited time. So Paul spoke about the difficulty of having to make choices between use of time, between running and conditioning. Now, one thing soccer do really well at a number of levels is they do game-based conditioning or skill-based conditioning. Some of the very good soccer teams around the world won't do running. They'll just do soccer training. But what they'll do is they manipulate the size of the ground when they train to get different objectives. So for an aerobic drill, they would have a larger ground and they'd have a more continuous play. So they would not stop the drill, they just play continuously on a larger field. For sharp, intense, that sort of B5 stuff we spoke about, they'd bring the size of the ground right in and have in-close, sharp work for short periods. Soccer did that really well, and AFL's starting to get there. And I've got this graph because we looked really closely at how actually the size of your grid in, and this is a 5v5 handball game. Same players, just sort of set up. All we've changed in the same game, all we've changed for the three different graphs is the size of the grid. So the first one's quite small, 20 metres by 15 metres, then they're 40 by 30 and then 80 by 60. The blue line here is a bit deceptive. So actually there's more players per area, the higher density here. And then gradually there's more space per player for each of the grids, obviously because you increase the size per player. The first thing to notice is the more space, the less change of direction. So the red line at the top, we have it on the GPS, we measure change of direction, how much our players change direction, a bit arbitrary. But you can see, expect this, that you more space, you have less change of direction. Also, so the purple line is B3 running, so running over 18 km an hour. You can't do much of that in a really small space. You just have the space to open up. So in a medium-sized grid, we get considerably more. We get most of it in the larger grid. Again, what you'd expect. This just helps us get an idea of proportionally how we start to manipulate size for your conditioning. So rather than us going from 1 k'er, which might take 3.5 minutes, what we do 3.5 minutes of similar work in a football grid. Green line is metres per minute, so that's volume, so that's how much distance the players are actually covering. So at 100 metres per minute, the small grid, if you ran that through for 10 minutes, you get a K. Again, I think GPS all the time because that's what I use. But in a general sense, think about the size and space and about how much distance players like a lot of recovery. Actually, getting a lot cheaper. I don't know if you've ever thought about getting a couple of new players or a coach or get a GPS watch and just wear them in a session. Give you a nice feel for the actual volume of the session. And they're becoming a lot more accessible. And the last thing is B4. So B4, again, just a reminder, was really high speed running, 24 km an hour or higher. Not enough space really to pick up your speed here, although you would get some of that sharpness stuff. Again, we didn't see much of it in that size grid. Once we opened it up, we had a reasonably increased the amount of high speed running because the players had the space to do it. So, which grid size am I going to use for different parts of conditioning? I'm probably picking this one for aerobic. You just got to get the size right because in our aerobic phase we don't want too much of this high speed running. We actually just want them to be able to control pace continuously. For our sharpness and our high speed stuff, I'm going to be here. But for our B4 running, high speed running, I'm probably picking that one because it's clearly better. But again, you're going to compromise a little bit on everything. You sort of get a feel for the amount of players, the amount of space, and coaching live will be really important too because if the footy gets hit out of the grid, someone else chases it, all of a sudden you've got a big rest. There'll be a whole lot of things just to watch for and ramp up or down the intensity of the drill. Really keep going. The other way to manipulate conditioning in football drills is through the numbers in a drill. So again, this one is basically just got a consistent size grid, 40 by 30. But what we changed was the number of players in the handball game. Now this isn't a massive scientific study. This is just something we did once. So some of the numbers are a little bit confusing, but they generally hold true to what you expect. So there's more area per player if you've got less players, obviously less maths. if there's more area per player, players tend to cover more ground. They are in the drill. They seem to do about the same amount of B3 running, but they certainly had higher levels of high-speed running, but there were less players in the same kind of space. So think about player density, how many players got a certain amount of space will affect how much they can run, what sort of run they tend to do. More change of direction when there's more people in the same area. You probably expect that. The aerobic heart rate's a bit confusing to me, but the lactic heart rate is about the same for each, which is good, I think, because in both situations you're working at a similar intensity in terms of your heart rate, but you're getting some higher speed running, less players, a greater change of direction, and probably sharpness with more players. So just some things to start to think about when you're planning drills. Think about your space, think about the number of players, the density, and maybe you get some of your conditioning objectives, some of the things that you might have to go normally just have to go running for by actually making the drill do what your conditioning coach or you want to get out of your players. Any questions on that? This is a general thing.
I'd like to know, just percentage-wise, like that vision of Parker, grassroots level, blokes just don't transition defensively.
Yeah.
But if you put a footy in a drill, they're more inclined to actually probably lift their work rate.
Yeah.
So what's your philosophy there? In terms of running, what would be the percentage to do game-based drill rather than just sprints?
Yeah, I think you should, particularly limited time, be doing as much game-based drill as you can. I really think that. You just got to be smart about watching it and actually seeing that you don't have players hiding in your drill, because that's the risk. In a 300 metre run, you can't hide, but in a drill, you just have to be onto it. That players are really invested in the drill, and having the footy involved in competitive element should take care of that. Yeah.
That's a pretty good point. Just sometimes I think when we're trying to get at our players who might be bludging by doing a battery of sprint work or interval stuff after some really hard game sense type training, sometimes we've got to be mindful we don't break our players who are really putting in the game sense stuff. And then they've got to back up and do a battery of really hard running, and they've just done a heap of efforts.
Yeah, it's a challenge, but that's coaching, isn't it, I suppose. This is another bit of a random thing. This one came from Bomber, actually. So Bomber said to me, how are we measuring in a game how hard it is? And, we measure GPS, we measure all sorts of things, and players rate out of 10 how hard they think the game was. But he said, no, how do we actually rate how hard was the game in terms of physicality, or how hard was this game compared to another game in terms of its, its complexity, how hard the players had to think through things. So we broke the game down into 4 sort of areas we thought were important to rate, and through the season we had players and coaches rate matches out of 10. In terms of 10 would be the hardest game you could ever imagine playing, and 0 would be doing nothing, on 4 components. So the components were high speed running, we measured GPS and B4, what the players actually thought, that how quick and how sharp was the game. So some games will be quite open, you do a lot of open running, some games will be close and sharp. How hard did our players have to think during the game? Was it complex? Was the other team doing something confusing? Or could they just be natural and generally play the way we wanted? And how tough was the physicality? And what we saw was it's actually quite sensitive to different games. So when we played Port, you see, so the purple line's the average of the year. And an interesting comparison is playing Port Adelaide, and they're a really strong, hard-running side. We saw the game opened up, so there was less change direction in close stuff we might have seen against other sides. There was more high-speed running. It wasn't as complex a game as the average of the other games, so there wasn't as much thinking. It was just open and generally free-flowing, but there was physicality in close, and I think that's a reflection of our quad have a pretty good mix between inside and outside. So then, how can we actually use this information in the pre-season? Well, we actually start thinking now about our drill selection and making sure that from week to week or to a period of pre-season, we're actually not missing any of these elements. Because the way we used the in-season was we'd plan training ahead for each week. But if we played 2 games in a row where, for whatever reason, our players, say we played Port Adelaide, and our players, we had a low sort of complexity, players didn't have to think too hard or too quick during the match. And we played Raiders and Sydney next week, and we'll do the same again. We didn't want to then run to a side that made us think really hard, because we actually might not be prepared for it. So if we played a game where we had to think too hard, we put a lot of complexity and decision making in our training. Similarly, if we're getting our contact and physicality in the games, we knew that we had the option, if we thought, we could ease back on that element of training. We're missing the change direction. A couple of weeks in a row, we don't get caught out, so let's put that in training. So, probably from a pre-season point of view, think about what your game requires when you come to play in season, and just make sure your drills and conditioning, you're not missing elements, particularly towards the end of the pre-season when you move into match play phase. Again, something that's pretty new to me, I only started looking at it in another interesting way. You don't need GPS, you don't need anything to do this. You just need to ask a couple of your leaders probably, or a couple of your key players, what was a drill like or what was a match like, and then you can get a bit of a feel from their point of view, how you might manipulate things from there. I think it's important in a pre-season presentation from a conditioning point of view to talk about injury prevention. One thing I do know for sure, because the research tells us again and again, is that the biggest risk of one of your players hurting themselves during the season is them hurting themselves in the pre-season. So if you injure yourself in the pre-season, you're much, much more likely to hurt yourself during the season when it really counts. So we try to get them fit without hurting them during the pre-season. I think probably the most important thing to understand is that change hurts players. You could condition just about anyone to run a marathon, but if you get them to run a marathon tomorrow, they might hurt themselves. It's just about progressive change and making sure that you don't change anything too sharply. That's part of the principle of making sure that your pre-season weeks look reasonably like your in-season weeks. So there's ways to monitor that. You can look at how much training you're doing weekly or session by session. You can just measure the time around the track. It's a pretty simple way of keeping a track on how much you're doing. Or you could measure your time and then ask players how hard it was and multiply the two together to get a measure of load. Or, like I mentioned, you get a couple of GPS watches out there and actually get some feedback on how much you've done. Be aware of other sort of changes, so changes in surface, changes in the amount of speed in your sessions, changes in how much kicking you're doing. If you've gone from a session where a player might have been lucky to have 3 kicks because it was match play and they played full back or something, to a high kicking session, then they may not be conditioned for it. Just be aware of change. If a player starts doing weights and they never have before, that's going to be a change in their body and a stress in their body. So if you give players similar things than what they're used to, they will generally cope. It's change, and unfortunately AFL football sometimes requires things of players that they're not used to, but it's our job to try and reduce the likelihood of that. And probably the best way to stop a player hurting themselves in season is to make sure they've done everything that they'll be required to in the season through the pre-season. And that's part of the reason we make pre-season so hard, so they can actually physically cope with whatever the game throws at them. I tend to recommend backing off at least 1 week in 4. Even if you're progressive, if you just do a bit more forever, the body just tends to need a chance just to adapt, and stepping back 1 week in 3 or 1 week in 4 can just make sure your players get a chance just to recover, consolidate your gains, and adapt and go from there. This is one way we use to measure change, or how much our players doing is changing. And basically this is, we're going to get too sort of scientific here, is this is what our players are used to. It's just the average of distance for the last 3 weeks. And all we do here is we look at what they're used to, which is the average of the last 3 weeks, compared to what they do next week. And if the difference between those two is really high, there's some alarm bells. Just as a general guide, I'll look at about 130% as good marks for a round or other. So what our players are used to, what they've done the last few weeks, what we're about to do. If that's considerably different, you're accepting an element of risk. You can look at this as well session by session, but it can be hard because often there's quite a lot of variation in sessions. But I tend to find 130% is probably unreasonable session by session. Players can tend to cope with it in the occasional really big session. So again, whether you're measuring time or distance or load or whatever, it can be useful just getting a feel for how different what you plan to do is to what your players are used to. Because if it's too different, it might hurt something. Everyone sort of agreed it's a reasonable principle. This is just one way you can measure it as a percentage. I think monitoring your players is really important. And the most important aspect of that is to communicate with them and ask them how they're coping. We do a few different things, like our players do wellness charts and they send in, out of 10 muscle soreness and all these different things. There's no reason you can't do that, but all I use that information for is as a trigger to talk to a player. So if a player says, look, muscle soreness is 8 out of 10, and I read that in the morning, and they're normally a 4 or 5 or something, all that does to me is tell me to go and talk to that player and find out what's going on. Because a good example is a player can record poor sleep. They might say I slept for 4 hours last night. And you talk to them and they've been up watching the Premier League, and it's a one-off. And there's really no reason to change their training or anything else, I don't think. But your communication relationship with a player becomes really important, that you can just keep a track of how they're going, talk to them and get a real feel for whether or not they might need a little bit less or even at times a little bit more. Because that can be the difference sometimes. And I think just using numbers, just asking for numbers and using numbers to make decisions probably doesn't work, but you can use the numbers as a trigger for you to talk to them and actually get a real feel for where they're at and how they're coping. And you'll know your players as well as anyone.
What about the group of players who are struggling for their spot? And trying to get the truth out of those sort of guys about how they're feeling because they want to miss a session or particularly a game they want to get back in the team.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Even if you ask them how they're feeling out of 10, and if you're close to dropping out of the team, you're not going to rate a 3, are you? You're probably going to be giving some good numbers. I think that's also talking to the player and actually knowing them, getting a feel for them. We try to use some objective things, so we might measure their groin squeeze, or we might just track their GPS numbers and other things. Some ways they can't hide from. But I think the answer to that is understand where they're at, and also if they are close to being in or out of the team, then generally sort of supportive of them getting involved in sessions, I reckon. But while you don't want to break them, you also don't want to reduce their opportunity to actually break them to the side. So that's a difficult situation, but one you certainly come across. Just some basics for recovery. There's 1,000 ways to skin a cat for recovery. This is just what we do as a minimum. Our players, after a session, whether it's running or skills, will get in the hot spa for 3 minutes and then the cold plunge for 3 minutes, and they'll repeat that 3 times, and they'll do foam roller. I really just see this as a way of shutting the players off and getting them in recovery mode. Best sort of recovery is sleep, and the next best is actually being relaxed and that's the time your body's recovering. So I'm not sure how much recovery your body's actually doing while it's in the cold plunge, but certainly afterwards, it's a real signal to the body just you can actually relax now and actually start into some recovery phase. The other thing we do is foam roller. So I think I've got a couple of... I've got some, these are the basic ones that we do just as a minimum. Again, just a way of self-massage. Now, these things are available from Rebel or all sorts of different places. And not a bad way for players to roll out key areas that we know in AFL football generally get tight, particularly through pre-season, which is your glutes, your calves, and your ITBs, just the muscle on the side of your thigh. So some really basic stuff. I think recovery can get overcomplicated. The most important thing is to make sure your players are sleeping and reducing their stress where possible in between sessions and letting them relax and recover. That's all the content I put in these slides. So I'm really keen to take some questions and talk about some stuff. Yeah.
Just a question on your spider web, Brett.
Oh yeah. Do you go back to it?
Just looking at the pre-season, obviously 9 out of 10 I think is your contact and physical. In the pre-season, how and when does that start? Especially looking at youth and body size and all that. But how do you train? How do you get the ready? Obviously the gym and the aerobic stuff, but the contact and the physicality in the pre-season. When does that start?
Yeah, I'd like to give some of it from the start, but then you're not really ramping it up probably from our point of view afterwards. But by the time the players are in any sort of match practice, you're not going to be ready to take this. And there's an element of body getting used to taking it and being used to contact. So I'll be looking, 2, 3, 4 weeks before you put that into a match practice, actually incorporating some drills, some contact against some tackling against some rugby will tell you do actually have to recover from contact, but I don't have much issue with being really aggressive. It's really important to have that.
Justin, traditionally grassroots in season is Tuesday, Thursday.
Yeah.
And Tuesdays they can't walk.
Yeah.
So they'll play a game, they'll get on the alcohol and get up at 3 in the morning.
Yeah.
And then open your Tuesdays.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts about changing that so your main sessions on a Thursday? So not contact, but game sense stuff on a Thursday, that's the main session for Saturday.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Have a bigger, higher quality session. Maybe you soon use that one to recover if that's where they're at. Makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know if we'll do it this season with James, but certainly with Bomber we structured our week so we have one big session through the week where we can be looking at contact, we can have guys on that speed because they're recovered. We can train like we want to play. Because if you're half trained twice,
Are you going to get guys who had surgery after pre-season up to speed to get that fitness?
Really good question. It's hard to catch up. What will happen is player will have surgery and they might not join for a week later. Where they start is giving the guys who have gone through their work. And it's a really big challenge. I think to be aware of some period of not just going with nothing, actually just incorporating that into this maybe you're going to train for an hour, you might start off with 20 minutes and then do the coping 30 and coping 40 and eventually that match up. If you're not careful, those players will themselves don't get another one. So that's a real challenge we find. Yeah, guys progress so quickly. Every player misses a week or two that you have they're working things out. Like I said, they're working things out over the weekend. They're aware that may not be able to jump straight out with another roster.
Just thinking about
season stuff like pre-game warm-ups and stuff like that. What sort of intensity you're looking at for the level that they get to before the game? Right?
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't know if my philosophy is the same as everyone else's, but I think AFL football goes for a long time. Like the game goes for 2 hours of play, plus your half time, plus your pre-match warm-up, everything else, and that's a really long time to concentrate for. So my pre-match warm-ups are all about reducing the thinking requirements early and the arousal, because we're eating all your emotional energy tickets 40 minutes before the match. It might leave exposed towards the end. So we do some movement and we do some structural stuff, in that 40 minutes to maybe 20 minutes before period, get a little bit of break, check the coach, and then we ramp up right again. Part of the other thing though is when our players run out in front of 30,000, they get excited very easily. We don't really need to rev them up very much. It's very good players to do that. And I imagine whatever level you're playing, there's no excitement when you go playing. So my philosophy is generally don't spend all your tickets in your warm-up. Make sure you've done some of the movements, most of the things they're going to need to do when they play. Keep them calm, and then if you want to do a bit of a kick again, that's fair enough.
So you keep them in that sort of aerobic 60 to 80 or?
Even lower. Yeah, just keep them relaxed. And we've done that first warm-up you see out on the ground on match day. We're doing sometimes in runners. Encourage guys just like the hit outs, hit the target, shots the goal, bit of movement, bit of feel to the ground. I know other players who do higher intensity things at that stage, and there's probably merit in that as well, but I tend to think that it's such a big emotional investment that they have at any level. They leave themselves exhausted.
Just wanted to know your thoughts maybe on the more psychology part of pre-season training. Just most pre-seasons, you can remember one session where you just get absolutely flogged. Just about getting that balance between looking after your players and preventing injury, but also wanting to get something out of it that's more on the mental side of things.
Really, really important part of coaching. That part of that, from my point of view, is actually the pre-season is actually going to be harder to prepare for the hardest possible thing. Start with the end in mind. So I really sell that session of players. This is actually really important. Football's pretty brutal. We need to get ready for that, and that's psychological as well as physical. That's probably that aspect of it. I think in terms of placing in the program, put it as a big session. And maybe just be really aware of how they turn up for the next one. If they're, you're probably just as likely to hurt them in a couple of sessions after as that one, if you're not careful. So just aware where they're at. If they're really struggling afterwards, maybe just, I don't think compromise on your big tough session, but be careful a couple afterwards.
Is that mainly for your own motivation, Jaden, to get through pre-season, mate?
That's all right. I won't be telling Daryl this.
Is this important as international?
One thing not many of the senior coaches here control versus what we can at a league level is what our players do. Now, there's always a battle, and probably a little bit of psychology too. Stinking hot. January, Central Victoria, Northern Victoria. If you've been a student all day or you've been working in an office all day, it's not bad. You can afford to get down there. If you've had tradies going around on roofs or really manual work, we've probably got to work out a way of recognising we just can't smash those blocks. They've already been smashed.
Hopefully they're honest enough and have a good relationship with each other too. Because if you had a tough hot day and they're on the road and actually tired, you probably will hurt yourself. I think it's spot on. You just have to somehow be aware of who those guys are. And it's not unfair. It's like to take a bit off on that day, maybe one other time to walk broken, maybe go something. I don't know. I was sitting inside that situation, but they're high risk.
I I think I was adding on a point from there. I think at this level, the biggest challenge is individualising, and I think that's where you can be at the forefront of your club, in that you don't have the consistency of players. Like, you mightn't have the same list at the end of the season as you're going into pre-season. So if you can debrief the individual, find out their weaknesses, what they're doing, like you would have cricket players and you don't see them, not wanting to point at south, but finishing on the bottom, and they were the people who put their hand up and said they've started. Like, that's really good because you missed out on finals. So I think if we individualise our debrief and find out who you've got as weaknesses, and you can compress them.
People appreciate having something specific thing. Yeah, that's a bit of a hard is if you know it's going to help you and you can actually do it for a reason. That's really important. Again, that takes time and a really strong relationship with players. Yeah.
That 1 in 4. That fourth week, that's pretty intense. You know, like that one, like that, the week that you have off, how sort of wide do you make that?
I tend to build 1 week, or 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, and the fourth week, if you can come off that. Yeah, because
then you go back again.
Yeah, you probably go back to almost as hard as that last week. If you come right back, the guys can actually recover. It takes a ball for a coach to actually sometimes come back that much. But your players will really reward you for any good pressure. We've said in season, with pre-season as well, we take that gas off, make them start a bit more faded. They'll be great in this sort of. Sorry,
Yeah, no, you just answered it there. I was just going to say about introducing something before, just so that's a bit more. Yeah, Justin, we know that when you're in a lactate stage, that's going to affect the quality of your decision making.
Yeah.
So when you're doing that drilling work with them, how do you you get some sort of cognitive thinking overlay to put in there, try to get them to keep the mind on the job when you're actually in that state?
Yeah, there's certainly some pretty quick feedback if they're making poor decisions at that state. I don't think it's important not to let that poor decision become acceptable because of that. It's a good question. It's probably more of a coaching question. But I think one of the real advantages of taking into that situation is to challenge and the standard drill can really drop if players get tight, but it's so important to practice that and also make it understood that's not really acceptable for it to drop. A lot of that pain that's coming is actually perception.
Justin, the pre-season part of the staff, what sort of numbers are there for the coaches? For us, coaches, physios, and everybody, obviously pre-season, essential country sort of things to get the players there fine, and they get cold in the hand. What sort of numbers are there?
I've got a lot more stuff in the bar with health. At the track, I have myself, so 70 Tom Horns, with a GPS analyst on the computer, rating the off-head coach. I've got a dog position coach who looks after the New Zealand players. Another position coach, more the overall weights coach in the gym, a rare coach in the rare group. We've had a physio inside, outside, doctor outside, and the coaching staff. So there's a hell of a team. I think a lot of us stand out from the match all the time. And you run sessions with a couple of people, but you run some 4 to 50 meetings and what's the big difference. You
Right, any last question? I've got one, but has anyone else got one? Yep.
Every time you work with your players, get massages and everything, help them do it.
That players get massages twice a week, but I reckon they're addicted. I never used to like massage as a player, but I was playing. I see massage, there's a physical component, right? But there's a way that helps them switch off and relax. I think that actually relaxing and recovery is really important. So I'll leave it in because we might take the chocolate off on it. There's a great psychological aspect of massage, which is you actually relax and recover. So worth that. The physical stuff maybe helps them.
So my question is a little bit related. Could you just talk us through a little bit of the science, Justin, of the rollers?
Oh, yeah.
Who out there has actually used the foam rollers? Yep.
The other thing is you can actually use a footy. If you don't have a roller, you'd probably end up with an egg in your footy if you go for too long. Or with a PVC pipe. That makes it need to be comfortable. So basically what the roller does is it's self-massage, but say your calves get tightened up after a lot of running. It's just giving them that feedback that with that strong pressure, it's actually relax and settle down a bit. ITB is the same. These areas that tend to get tight, and the physical release of those areas can just help free out the rest of your body. So I'd recommend that over. I like things players do for themselves. Probably really when you shoot with massaging is just someone who does something for you. Whereas this is, you've got a player in this upper section that do it themselves, and you need more effort to really do that. That's why I push these probably more so than right table and get fixed or anything.
We might leave it there, Justin. We've milked a fair bit of time out of you. Just the level of planning expertise that Justin's demonstrated at the elite level at Essendon is mind-blowing, I'm sure, for a lot of people in the room. It was a great opportunity for us to be immersed in Essendon in high performance for over an hour. But a lot of the techniques and particularly some of the charts that Justin's used could be really quite useful at all levels. But for me, one of the main messages was the importance of communication and talking to players consistently and finding out where they're at as human beings. It's probably still the most important part of any coaching, high performance or otherwise. So can we just put our hands together for Justin? It's fantastic.